Welcome. Be sure to like and subscribe for more scary stories, or I will come for you. If anyone would like early access to my latest stories and an ad-free listening experience, consider becoming one of the Curator's disciples. The link is in the description below. Let's get stuck into today's fucked up story. Lux Veritatis by the Curator. So, a bit of backstory first. My name's Rob, and I'm 45. My life's a bit of a mess, but I'm not gonna sit here and make excuses. I used to work for the NSA. Yeah, the big leagues. It sounds cooler than it was. Trust me, I wasn't out there chasing spies, or whatever you're picturing. I mostly sat behind a desk analyzing data. My job was to find patterns in online chatter and identify threats. At one point, I was even pretty good at it. But one mistake, one massive screw-up, ruined everything for me. This was about 6 years ago. We were tracking a cartel, one of the nastiest ones. They were smuggling drugs across borders, laundering money, the whole thing. I'll spare you the boring details, but long story short, we had an undercover informant embedded in their operations. My job was to protect his identity by securing our systems, and I failed. Someone got through our firewall, found his name, and leaked it. 2 weeks later, that informant was found in a ditch somewhere in Mexico, tortured to death. I wasn't there, but I heard the details. Stuff you don't forget. I don't know who hacked us or how, but I was the one responsible for the breach. After that, I got shoved out of the NSA. It wasn't public or anything, more like they quietly told me to leave before they made it official. I tried working for cybersecurity firms, but that guilt followed me everywhere. Every time I got an assignment, all I could think was, what if I mess up again? Eventually, I went freelance. The pay sucked, but at least I didn't have to look anyone in the eye. That's when this job came along. It was weird, right off the bat. No company name, no introduction, just a generic address and a simple message. We need your expertise. Full discretion required. Pay $2 million in cryptocurrency. Respond if interested. At first, I thought it was a scam. Nobody pays $2 million for anything, let alone from some random dude they found online. But I don't know. Something about it stuck with me. Maybe it was the money, or maybe it was because I was desperate. Either way, I replied. The response came back almost instantly. They asked for my PGP key, which is basically a super secure way to communicate online. Most people don't even know what that is, so this wasn't your average scammer. That was my first red flag. They gave me the details. The job was to secure an anonymous forum on the dark web called Lux Veritatis. That means light of truth in Latin. Apparently, it was some whistleblower site where people could post dirt on companies and governments without fear of getting caught. They wanted me to make sure it was unhackable. It actually sounded noble. I don't know. Like I'd be doing something good for once, you know. Maybe even making up for what happened all those years ago. But the more I thought about it, the weirder it got. Why would they pay me that much for something I'd usually charge a couple grand for? I told myself it didn't matter. I needed the money, and honestly, I wanted to feel useful again. So I took the job. At first, everything seemed straightforward. The forum was legit, or at least it looked that way. The layout was basic, nothing fancy. People were posting about all kinds of stuff. Corporations dumping toxic waste, pharmaceutical companies running illegal drug trials, politicians taking bribes. The kind of stuff that makes you think, yeah, the world's screwed up. My job was simple: upgrade their encryption and make sure no one could trace the users. I worked day and night for a solid week, and when I was done, I felt proud, like maybe I'd finally done something right. But then, things started to feel off. The first thing I noticed was the code. There were layers of it buried deep in the back end of the site, stuff I hadn't put there and definitely didn't understand. It was sophisticated, way more advanced than anything I'd seen before. It reminded me of something we used to call a honeypot back in my NSA days. A honeypot is basically a trap. You create a fake system that looks secure, so hackers or whistleblowers or whoever think it's safe to use. But in reality, it's feeding all their information straight to you. I tried not to jump to conclusions. Maybe the site's founders had hired someone else to work on it before me. Or maybe I was just being paranoid. I mean, when you've seen the kind of stuff I've seen, it's hard not to expect the worst. Then the news started rolling in. The first story was about a climate scientist. She'd leaked a bunch of internal documents from an oil company showing they'd been covering up their role in global warming. It was all over the forum, people praising her for her courage. A week later, she was found dead. They said she fell while hiking, but the details didn't add up. Next was a nurse. She'd exposed some biotech company testing unapproved drugs on homeless people. She was on her way to Switzerland to testify when her car accidentally drove off a bridge. It didn't take long for me to realize the pattern. Every time someone posted something big, something that could really hurt a company or government, that person ended up dead. I started tracking IP addresses, something I wasn't technically supposed to do. The site was supposed to be anonymous, right? But I needed to know where all this was coming from. At first, it looked clean. Most of the user traffic bounced through multiple layers of VPNs and Tor relays. It'd take a small army of cybersecurity experts months to untangle it. But the moderators? That was a different story. The moderators of the site, the people who supposedly kept things running and ensured everything stayed anonymous, were sloppy. Their traffic kept leading me back to a shell corporation in Luxembourg. I ran the name through every database I could find, but it was like chasing a ghost. No offices, no employees, no paper trail. Just a registered name and a P.O. box. I should have stopped there. I should have told myself it wasn't my problem and cashed out the money they'd already paid me. But I couldn't. Something about this whole thing felt personal. Maybe it was the whistleblowers who kept dying. Maybe it was the guilt I still carried from my NSA days. Or maybe it was because deep down I knew I'd gotten in way over my head and couldn't back out even if I wanted to. So I kept digging. That's when I found it. There was a hidden database buried in the forum's back end, encrypted to hell and back. It took me 3 days of non-stop work to crack it. And when I finally did, I wish I hadn't. The database was a list. Thousands of names, all ranked by something called threat level. Each name had a photo, a brief description, and a set of coordinates. Most of the descriptions matched the stories I'd seen on the forum: whistleblowers, activists, journalists. But some of them didn't make sense. There were names of teachers, small-town doctors, even a few high school students. And the coordinates? They were locations, home addresses, workplaces, even vacation spots. It hit me like a brick. This wasn't just a forum. It was a hit list. I didn't sleep for 2 days after that. I just sat there, staring at my screen, trying to figure out what to do. If I went to the police, they'd laugh me out of the station. Hi, yes, I'd like to report an anonymous dark web forum. that's run by a bunch of shadowy elites killing whistleblowers. Yeah, that'd go over real well. So I did the only thing I could think of. I tried to contact the forum's founders. That's when I learned there weren't any founders. Or at least, not in the way I thought. The forum was run by a group calling themselves the Covenant. Yeah, I know how that sounds. Like some cheesy conspiracy theory. But trust me, it was anything but cheesy. I found their chat logs buried deep in the code, hidden behind layers of encryption. They talked like they were running some kind of, I don't even know, like a global cleanup crew. Their goal wasn't just to expose whistleblowers. It was to neutralize them. From what I could piece together, they were ex-intelligence officers, retired CEOs, private bankers, the kind of people who don't show up in the news, but run the world from behind the scenes. And the forum, it was their tool. They weren't protecting whistleblowers. They were baiting them. People thought Lux Veritatis was safe, but it was just a trap to lure them out. And once they posted something big enough to get on the Covenant's radar, it was game over. I wanted to walk away so badly. Just close my laptop, cash out, and forget this ever happened. But I couldn't. Because that's when I saw her name. Mara Hayes. My daughter. I just stared at the screen, stomach dropping like I'd been punched. I hadn't seen her name in years. Hell, I hadn't seen her in years. Not since she was 18, when she left for college and stopped answering my calls. I didn't blame her, really. I wasn't a great dad. After the NSA, I buried myself in work, trying to avoid the guilt, and I guess I buried her too. She'd always been so much like her mom. Stubborn, independent, fiery. I figured she didn't need me. But now her name was on this list. I clicked on it, my hands shaking. Her profile popped up. Mara Hayes, 24, investigative journalist. A picture of her smiling. One I hadn't even seen before. Along with a short description. Currently probing corporate corruption linked to biotech firms. And then the coordinates. Her apartment in DC. She wasn't just on the list. She was flagged as a level 1 threat, the highest ranking. The kind of threat the Covenant didn't just neutralize. They erased. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just moved. I grabbed my laptop, threw it in my bag, and booked the next flight to DC. The plane ride was a blur. All I could think about was Mara. I kept checking the time, imagining every possible scenario. What if they'd already gotten to her? What if I was too late? By the time I landed, it was almost midnight. I took a cab straight to her apartment. Her building was one of those old brick ones with crappy lighting in the hallways and a broken elevator. I pounded on her door until I heard movement inside. When she opened it, she looked different, older, tired, but her eyes still had that spark, the same one that used to terrify me when she was a teenager and hell-bent on proving me wrong about everything. "Dad," she said, blinking at me like she wasn't sure if I was real. "Can I come in?" My voice cracked. I sounded like a stranger, even to myself. She hesitated, then stepped aside. Her apartment was small, but neat. Papers were spread out on the coffee table, along with a laptop and about a dozen half-empty coffee mugs. The walls were covered in printouts, red string connecting them like some kind of conspiracy map. "What the hell are you doing here?" she finally asked, crossing her arms. I couldn't tell her the truth. "Not yet." So I lied. "I was in town for work," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thought I'd drop by." She didn't buy it. "You haven't dropped by in 6 years," she said, her voice sharp. "So try again." I sat down on the couch, running my hands through my hair. "Mara, you're in danger." She laughed. Actually laughed. "Yeah, no kidding," she said, waving at the chaos on her walls. "I've been pissing off billion-dollar corporations for months. What else is new?" "No, you don't understand," I said, leaning forward. "These people, they're not just going to sue you or ruin your career. They're going to kill you." That shut her up. I told her everything. About the forum, the database, the covenant, her name on the list. At first, she didn't believe me. She thought I was being paranoid or that I was trying to scare her into quitting her work. But then I showed her. I pulled up the database on my laptop and let her see for herself. Her name, her picture, her home address. She went pale. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, sitting down next to me. This is real." "Yes," I said. "And they're watching you. Probably right now." For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. But it didn't last long. "Then we expose them," she said, standing up and grabbing her laptop. "Mara, no." "Why not?" She snapped. "If this is real, people need to know. We need to blow the lid off this whole thing." I grabbed her arm, forcing her to look at me. "Because if you do, they'll kill you. And they'll kill me too." We argued for hours. She wanted to keep digging, to publish her findings and take the covenant down. I wanted to run, to disappear. I knew these people. I knew what they were capable of, and I knew we were already out of time. Around 3 a.m., her phone buzzed. She picked it up, frowning. "It's a text," she said. "No number." She turned the screen so I could see. "Stop now, or he dies." My blood ran cold. "They're watching us," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And then the lights went out. It was pitch black. I could hear Mara breathing, fast and shallow, somewhere to my left. "Stay quiet," I whispered, fumbling for my phone to use the flashlight. Before I could turn it on, there was a sound, a low, metallic scrape coming from the front door. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed Mara's arm and pulled her toward the kitchen. She didn't fight me this time. We crouched behind the counter, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. The scraping stopped. Then came the sound of the door opening. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. I reached for a knife on the counter, gripping it so tight my hand hurt. Mara clutched her laptop like a shield, her eyes wide in the dim glow of the emergency lights from the hallway. The footsteps moved closer, and then they stopped. Right on the other side of the counter. We didn't breathe. I could feel Mara trembling next to me, but she didn't make a sound. My grip on the knife tightened until I thought the handle would snap. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. No movement, no breathing, just the faint hum of the emergency lights outside the door. Then, a voice. It was low and calm, but there was something about it that made my stomach twist into knots. "Robert Hayes," it said. "Mara Hayes." Hearing my name like that, spoken so casually in the dark, sent a chill down my spine. Whoever this was, they weren't guessing. They knew exactly who we were. "You've made this unnecessarily complicated," the voice continued. It was coming from just above us now, on the other side of the counter. "But it doesn't have to end badly. Come out, and we can talk. No one has to get hurt." I didn't believe that for a second. Mara looked at me, her face pale and her eyes full of questions. "What do we do?" I shook my head slowly and held up one finger. Wait. The silence stretched on. The voice didn't speak again, but we could still hear them breathing. Close, too close. Then the footsteps started again, heading toward the hallway. They were baiting us, trying to draw us out. I glanced at Mara, then pointed to the window above the sink. It was small, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was our only chance. She nodded, understanding immediately. I moved first, as quietly as I could, and unlocked the window. The latch creaked, and I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps stopped. "What was that?" the voice said, suddenly sharp. I didn't wait to find out. I shoved the window open and motioned for Mara to go. She hesitated, looking back at me. "Go," I hissed. She climbed through, grunting as she struggled to squeeze through the narrow frame. The moment she was clear, I hoisted myself up and out after her, landing hard on the fire escape. We didn't stop running. Down the fire escape, across the alley, through the empty streets. I didn't even know where we were going. I just knew we had to get as far away as possible. Mara kept pace beside me, clutching her laptop to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her alive. "Who was that?" she finally asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I lied. I knew exactly who it was. The Covenant. They'd sent someone to tie up their loose ends. We ended up in a dingy motel on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions and didn't take credit cards. Perfect for hiding out, at least for the night. Mara sat on the bed, her laptop open in front of her, while I paced the room. "What are you doing?" I asked, glancing over at her. "Finding them," she said, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "Mara, stop." She ignored me. "You don't understand," I said, grabbing her wrist. "These people aren't some corporate goons you can scare off with a blog post. They're killers. They're untouchable. If you keep digging, they'll come after you again." "They already came after me," she snapped, pulling her arm away. "And you. So, what's the point of running? They're never going to stop, Dad. Not unless we stop them first." Her words hit me like a slap. "You don't get it," I said, my voice rising. "I've seen what they do. They don't just kill people. They erase them. You think those whistleblowers were brave? You think they wanted to die for the truth? No, they thought they were safe. Just like you do." She stared at me, her jaw tight. Maybe they weren't safe because no one tried to fight back. Maybe it's time someone did. I wanted to scream at her, to shake her, to make her understand that fighting wasn't an option. But the look in her eyes stopped me. She wasn't just being stubborn. She believed in what she was doing. And I hated her for it. Because deep down, I knew she was right. That's when my laptop buzzed. I froze, staring at the screen as a message popped up. It was encrypted, just like the ones I'd received when I first took the job. "We know where you are." A second message followed immediately. "Final warning. Deliver the laptop." "Mara," I said, my voice shaking. "They're coming." She didn't respond. Her eyes were glued to her own screen. "Did you hear me?" I said, louder this time. "I know," she said quietly. "What?" "I found them." I walked over and looked at her laptop. She'd hacked into the same database I'd found earlier, but she'd gone deeper. There was a live feed, names and faces flashing across the screen. Whistleblowers, activists, journalists. And then another feed. Security cameras. Hundreds of them. Offices, apartments, streets. One of them showed us. The motel room. I looked at the screen, then at the tiny black dot on the ceiling. The smoke detector. They've been watching us this whole time, Mara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I could respond, the window shattered. The sound was like a gunshot, and before I even realized what was happening, I grabbed Mara and pulled her to the floor. Glass rained down around us, and the cold night air rushed into the room. "Stay down," I hissed, crawling toward the bed and yanking the comforter off to shield us from the shards. The smoke detector camera. They'd been watching us the whole time. I'd underestimated them. Again. There was movement outside the broken window. Dark, shifting shapes against the dim glow of the motel's neon sign. Mara was frozen, her eyes locked on the jagged edges of the glass. "Mara, we need to go," I whispered. She shook her head, clutching her laptop like it was her lifeline. "They're here, Dad. We can't outrun them." The footsteps on the fire escape told me she was probably right. I didn't have time to argue. I grabbed the lamp off the bedside table and hurled it at the window. It smashed against the frame with a loud crash, and the figures outside ducked. "Move," I shouted, dragging her toward the door. We stumbled out into the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above us. I could hear more footsteps now, coming from the stairwell at the far end of the building. They weren't just sending one or two people. This was a full operation. My mind raced as I scanned the hall. There had to be a way out, a way to buy us time. "Mara," I said, grabbing her shoulders, "listen to me. You're going to go down the back stairs and run. Don't stop until you're far away from here. Do you understand?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not leaving you." "You don't have a choice," I snapped. "They're after you, not me. If they catch you, they'll kill you too." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw tears in her eyes. "I can't lose you again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I could respond, the sound of the stairwell door slamming open cut through the air. Heavy boots echoed down the hall, getting closer with every step. There was no time to think. I grabbed her hand and yanked her toward the opposite end of the hall. The fire exit door led us out into the back alley. It was dark and smelled like garbage, the dim light from a flickering street lamp casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. I pulled Mara behind a dumpster, crouching low and pressing my back against the cold metal. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "What now?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't know. The sound of voices and boots filled the alley. They were close, too close. I could hear them talking. Calm, methodical, like they'd done this 1,000 times before. "Room's empty," one of them said. "Check the perimeter." They couldn't have gotten far. I motioned for Mara to stay quiet, but she didn't need the warning. She was clutching her laptop so tightly her knuckles were white, her breath shallow and rapid. The footsteps grew louder, heading in our direction. I gripped the knife I'd taken from the motel room, my palms slick with sweat. I knew it wouldn't do much against these people, but it was all I had. And then, just when I thought they'd find us, a car screeched to a halt at the mouth of the alley. "Over here," someone shouted. The men hesitated, their attention drawn to the new arrival. I took the opportunity to grab Mara's arm and pull her deeper into the shadows. The car doors slammed, and more voices filled the air. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was enough to create chaos, enough to give us a chance. We ran. I don't even know how far we went. The streets blurred together, each corner looking more desolate than the last. By the time we stopped, we were in some abandoned industrial area, surrounded by rusted fences and crumbling warehouses. Mara collapsed against a wall, gasping for air. I leaned against the same wall, trying to catch my breath. We need to figure out how they're tracking us. She looked at me, her face pale and streaked with sweat. The camera in the motel. They knew exactly where we were. It's not just that, I said, shaking my head. They're too fast. Too precise. They're tracking us in real time. She frowned, then her eyes widened. My laptop. What? She opened it, her hand shaking. They've been in my system this whole time. I thought I was tracking them, but they've been tracking me. She turned the screen toward me, showing a string of code that didn't belong there. A backdoor, something I should have seen, but hadn't. It's not just your laptop, I said, realization dawning. I reached into my bag and pulled out mine, opening it to find the same thing. They'd been 2 steps ahead of us the entire time. Mara started typing furiously, her fingers a blur across the keyboard. I can shut them out, she said, her voice tight with concentration. If I can just... Mara, I said, cutting her off. We don't have time. They're already on their way. She didn't stop. I'm not letting them win, Dad. Not again. And then, just as she hit enter, the screen went black. Not just her laptop. Mine too. The streetlights around us flickered and died, plunging the area into darkness. And in the distance, I heard the sound of engines. They were coming. The sound of engines grew louder, reverberating through the empty streets like a drumbeat. I grabbed Mara's arm, yanking her to her feet. We need to move. Now. Her eyes darted toward the darkness, her breathing shallow. They killed the power. How? Doesn't matter, I snapped. They're not here to talk. We stumbled into the nearest alley, the shadows swallowing us whole. The darkness was disorienting. Every step felt like it was leading us deeper into a maze we couldn't escape. My mind was racing, trying to figure out our next move. Mara clutched her useless laptop to her chest like it was a lifeline. I can fix this, she whispered, more to herself than me. I just need time. Time. That was the one thing we didn't have. Behind us, the engines roared closer. Headlights cut through the night, beams sweeping the streets as the vehicles slowed. I glanced back, catching a glimpse of black SUVs with tinted windows. They were coordinated, fanning out like wolves circling their prey. Dad, Mara whispered, her voice shaking. I turned back to her, realizing too late that she'd frozen in place. Her face was pale, her eyes locked on something ahead of us. I followed her gaze. There was someone standing at the end of the alley. A man. He was tall, dressed in black, his face obscured by the shadows. But what sent a jolt of terror through me was the thing in his hand. A long, thin object, glinting faintly in the darkness. A knife. For a moment, none of us moved. The man tilted his head slightly, as if he were studying us. Then, with an eerie calmness, he started walking toward us. Mara, I said, grabbing her wrist. Run. But, run. She hesitated for only a second before turning and sprinting down the alley. I followed her, my heart pounding, the sound of the man's deliberate footsteps echoing behind us. The alley twisted and turned, a labyrinth of narrow passages and dead ends. Every corner we rounded felt like it could be our last. Where are we going? Mara gasped, her voice trembling. Just keep moving, I said. We'll find a way out. But I didn't believe it. The SUVs were still out there, sweeping the streets, while this man, this thing, was herding us deeper into the maze. And then we hit the dead end. It was a brick wall, too high to climb and too solid to break through. Mara stopped, spinning around in a panic. What now? I scanned the alley, my mind racing. There was no way out. No fire escapes, no doors, nothing. And then I heard it. The footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I stepped in front of Mara, gripping the knife I'd taken from the motel. It felt pathetic in my hand, like a toy compared to the weapon the man was carrying. "Stay behind me," I said, my voice shaking. She didn't argue. The man appeared at the mouth of the alley, his figure silhouetted against the faint glow of distant headlights. He stopped a few feet away, the knife in his hand catching the light. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice smooth and unhurried, "you've caused us quite a bit of trouble tonight." I tightened my grip on the knife. "Stay back." He ignored me, taking another step forward. "This doesn't have to end violently," he said. "Hand over the girl, and I'll make sure your death is painless." Mara clutched my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. I could feel her trembling, but she didn't make a sound. "Over my dead body," I said. The man smiled, a cold, empty expression that sent a shiver down my spine. "That can be arranged." And then he lunged. It happened so fast I barely had time to react. I swung my knife wildly, but he dodged it with ease, his movements precise and calculated. His blade flashed in the darkness, aiming for my throat. I stumbled back, narrowly avoiding the strike. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear over the blood rushing in my ears. "Mara, run!" I shouted, but she didn't move. The man came at me again, and this time I wasn't quick enough. The blade slashed across my arm, sending a jolt of pain through my body. I cried out, but I didn't drop the knife. I couldn't. I swung again, this time catching him off guard. The blade grazed his shoulder, and he hissed in pain, stepping back for just a moment. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Mara, go," I shouted again, and this time she listened. She bolted past him, her laptop clutched to her chest, and disappeared into the shadows. The man turned his head slightly, watching her go. Then he looked back at me. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice calm and cold. I knew I couldn't win this fight, but I wasn't about to make it easy for him. I knew I wasn't walking out of that alley alive. My arm was burning from the cut, blood dripping onto the pavement, but I tightened my grip on the knife. If this was it, I wasn't going down without a fight. The man moved toward me again, faster this time. His strikes were controlled, precise, like he was toying with me. I managed to block one of his swings, but the force knocked the knife from my hand. It clattered to the ground, spinning out of reach. I backed up until my shoulders hit the brick wall. There was nowhere left to go. "Any last words, Mr. Hayes?" he asked, raising his blade. I stared at him, trying to buy time. "You don't have to do this." He smiled again, that cold, empty smile. "But I do." And then he lunged. Before I could react, a loud crack echoed through the alley. The man froze mid-step, his expression shifting to one of shock. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, but then I saw the blood blooming across his chest. He stumbled back, dropping the knife, and collapsed onto the ground. I turned to see Mara, standing at the mouth of the alley, holding a tire iron. Her chest was heaving, her face pale, but her grip on the weapon was steady. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaking. I nodded, still in shock. "We need to go," she said, tossing the tire iron aside and grabbing my arm. "They're going to send more." I didn't argue. We made it to a nearby bus station. ducking into the shadows while Mara hacked into her laptop. It hadn't taken long for her to restore power and patch the back door. She was running on adrenaline, typing faster than I thought was humanly possible. "They'll keep coming," I said, watching her work. "I know," she replied, not looking up. "That's why I'm finishing this now." "What are you doing?" "Uploading everything," she said, her voice grim. "The list, their names, the database, everything. Once it's out there, they won't be able to hide anymore. Mara, if you do that, they'll kill us both." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a kind of defiance I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. "They're going to kill us anyway," she said. "At least this way, it'll mean something." I didn't have an argument for that. It only took her a few minutes to finish, but it felt like hours. When she was done, she slammed the laptop shut and leaned back against the bench, exhaling shakily. "It's done," she said. "Where did you send it?" "Everywhere," she said. "Journalists, activists, government watchdogs. Anyone who'll listen." I nodded, a strange sense of calm washing over me. It was out of our hands now. But that calm didn't last long. The sound of engines echoed through the empty streets, and I knew they'd found us. We didn't wait for them to close in. We ran, disappearing into the night, the headlights of their SUVs cutting through the fog. I don't know how long we'll survive. They'll keep coming, I know that much. The Covenant doesn't leave loose ends. But Mara was right. If we're going down, we're taking them with us. And maybe, just maybe, the truth will be enough to bring them down. If this is my last post, you'll know why. If you're reading this, don't trust anyone. Don't think you're safe. This is the Curator. I hope you've enjoyed today's scary story. Until next time.